Good afternoon, everyone. I'll test the microphone with a few little short stories here that have nothing to do with mysticism. Okay. But since this is an election year, this is one of the better little jokes I've heard about politics this year. But they tell a story of a politician, and he died. And he got up to see St. Peter, and Peter said, "We have a whole new system now, and you actually get to vote whether you go to heaven or hell." So he said, "We're going to give you a vote, but we're going to give you a day in heaven and a day in hell, and you can sort out which one you want, and you can vote for either one." So the politician said, "Fine." He said, I'll do hell first, get it over with." So he takes a long elevator down a shaft, and he comes down to hell, and hell is wonderful. It's a country club. Satan, Lucifer, is the nicest man he's met, has his hand on his shoulder all day, takes him golfing, takes him for fine dining, and he goes back up to heaven. And the next day he spends in heaven, and heaven was like he had imagined, lots of clouds, angels, pretty fluffy, it was nice, but not so exciting. So he went to Peter and he said, "I've decided I'm going to go to hell." He said, Peter said, "You want to think about it?" He said, No. Peter said, "Here's the ballot. You mark heaven, hell." So he marked hell. And he went back down the long elevator shaft, and now everything was different. Hell was a cesspool, Satan was mean, everything was awful. So he saw Satan, he says, I was here 2 days ago, and it was wonderful. What happened? Satan said, 2 days ago we were in campaign mode. Okay. He said, and now you voted. Okay. A little more pious was the story told of this young woman, and she decided to give up sweets for Lent. After all, Lent is a season of asceticism, so she decided no sweets for Lent. But the problem was there was an exquisite pastry shop between her and her place of work. So it was quite a chore to get by this pastry shop every day. And so what she did, she thought the only way to do this is to eliminate the temptation. So she took an alternate route to work. No temptation, no problem. Until one day the alternate route to work was blocked by construction. So now what to do? So she thought, this could be a signal today from God that today God wants me to have a pastry. But she said, "I will discern this. I won't do this blindly." She said, "This will be the discernment." And I'm sure you've all done these little tests. She says, "I'll make this deal. If there's a parking spot open when I get there, then God wants me to have the pastry because very limited parking. If the parking spot is not open, God doesn't want me to have the pastry." Well, God is good. Okay. On her 6th cycle around the parking spot. Okay, we want to look a little bit now at a contemporary mystic, Ruth Burroughs, who's also a Carmelite. Ruth Burroughs, who actually goes by the name Rachel. She is Sister Rachel. And interestingly, there are a good number of sisters in her own convent that don't know that Sister Rachel is Ruth Burroughs, the author. So Ruth Burroughs is a pen name that she's tried to keep her identity discreet because, among other things, she doesn't want half the world beating to her door. And she's a British Carmelite in a monastery outside of Norwich, England. So I'm narrowing it down. Okay. She's now in her early 80s. But in wonderful health and in wonderful spirit. And I want to give you a little bit about her life, and then I want to say her contribution in the area of mysticism and some of her depth. And then briefly, but more briefly, we'll look at her own mystical schema, which is a little different than the classical Carmelite, a little different than John of the Cross and so on. But let's look a little bit at her life. She has many books. But the 2 books you'd want to read and function if we're talking about this afternoon. She has a book called Before the Living God. And they're on the last page of your handouts. You should find a handout there. And that is her autobiography, which she wrote late 70s, early 80s. So it's already about 30 years old. She wrote it when she was middle-aged. She's 80-some now. And then her book, which made her famous, called Guidelines for Mystical Prayer. So it's a wonderful title. Guidelines for Mystical Prayer. Now, she's written a commentary on John of the Cross. She has a number of books on prayer. on asceticism that are also very good, but these are the ones that focus more on what we'll be talking about this afternoon. A bit about her background. She grew up in a very normal Catholic, but not very Catholic Christian family in England. And she was sent to a boarding school for high school, which is very common still in England, where you go to a boarding school, but her parents sent her there, her parents sent her there not for the religious part, just because it was a chance to get a little better education. And by her own admission, she was not even half serious about religion as a young woman. She said in high school, she said, I was a practicing Catholic, but, just the minimum. And she described herself as being somewhat religiously bored, indifferent, sometimes to the point of being what she called airheaded. And during her senior year in school, so what we would call grade 12, the seniors had to go on a graduation retreat. And though you have to remember, fairly religiously indifferent, practicing Catholic, but bored with religion, all kinds of other dreams for her life and so on. And they went on this retreat, the boarding school, and an incident happened where she and another girl were acting out, laughing and gossiping or whatever, in the chapel, and one of the sisters reprimanded them, and then they got kind of what they call an adult timeout, I guess you'd call it, And the others went to some recreative activity, and she and the other girl were consigned to chapel for 2 hours, where they were supposed to sit in silence. And this was enforced by a nun watching that the silence was enforced, So she said she was putting in the 2 hours, and not necessarily even trying to pray, but 2 hours is a long time just to sit. She said, and sometime during those 2 hours, she had a mystical experience. The way she's going to define mysticism. Which changed her life forever, okay? But the mystical experience was not some, altered state of consciousness. It was not some angel appearing. It was something very ordinary, but very deep. So at a certain point, she said, I just had this deep, not even conscious at the time, just sense of who I was and that God was and what I was called to. So and we're going to define mysticism for her in a few minutes. So I just had this deep gut sense of who I was, really, in God's eyes, and who God was. Said, no, you don't even think this thing, you don't even feel it, you just know it. Said, and I knew I had to be a Carmelite nun. I knew I had to be serious religiously. And from there on, she joined the Carmelites for the next some months. I want to come back on her experience afterwards, the way she defines mysticism, which for me today is the working definition of mysticism. But we'll unpackage that and get back to her experience. So she joins the Carmelites. She joins the Carmelites knowing that this is what she needs to do, supposed to do, that's going to bring her life. But initially, she's fighting it a lot. It was not a very good initial fit. So she had a lot of problems early on in religious life, not moral problems, but psychological problems. Frustration, acting out, not hysteria, but close to it, lots of tears and lots of temper tantrums and back and forth and so on. But never that she ever contemplated leaving. But she said also at the time, said it was me, said, but the Carmelite Carmel that she's with and is still with, she says, we are also not where we should be. Years back, and even when I joined the Oblates and so on, but religious life at the time, sometimes it was anti-intellectual, it was overly pious. So it said our library had no good books whatsoever. We were almost sheltered from contemporary thought. And so you're going to see, she's this artist with an artist's temperament, with all this intellectuality and they say the catechism should do it for you. What else do you need? Or the Imitation of Christ, or you have 2 or 3 books and so on, which in their own way are decent books. But she said the rule was very, very, very restrictive, and not in a good sense. Rules can be very, very strong and aesthetic, but in a good sense. That our convent wasn't that it was unhealthy. It was simply pre-Vatican II, very Trent. But she said it was suffocating for anybody who really wanted to think. You could pray, but you couldn't think. in a Carmel there. But she said, I was also very immature, and so she had some really rough years where she never contemplated leaving, but the Carmelites contemplated her leaving. Sometimes they wouldn't have minded her voluntarily exiting, and so on. She said, and then slowly it got better, and it got much, much better. And she said, slowly I took to this life, and slowly the life took to me, and she said, and Vatican II came along, and we got some sharper leaders, and said they began to not to relax the rule in the bad sense, but to open Carmel to where it should be, so it becomes the heart of the world. And she began to be able to study and do things, and she said, I began to blossom, and the monastery she was in said, it also began to blossom. And then, not too long after, during that time, then she wrote her autobiography, Before the Living God. I'm going to explain the part of the purpose for that in a few minutes with her parents and her father and so on. And then she also wrote Guidelines for Mystical Prayer during that time. And then she was elected the prioress of the convent, and she stayed in that position until she became about 80 years old, and she retired, and she's there right now. I've gone to visit her. I didn't get to visit Therese of Lisieux, but I've gone to visit Ruth Burroughs a good number of times. She's when I talk about her temperament, she's a wonderfully gracious, happy woman who fills a room with light and lots of humor and lots of wit and so on. It's interesting. Sometimes I'm teaching a course right now at night on mysticism, and one of my students asked me the other night, they said, like, and he's a psychologist, he said, I just read Ruth Burroughs' autobiography, and, like, is she still this tortured soul and so on? And I said, she's one of the happiest person I've ever met, and sometimes that goes together with owning your complexity rather than denying it. Okay. Then she becomes the prioress, and at this time she reconciles with her father. This is the little story. She said her mother was not supportive either way, but her father was absolutely dead set on her becoming a nun and a Carmelite. And he said, if you become that, you're cut off, and I'll never talk to you again. She became that, and that was the first 18 or 20 years of her life as a Carmelite with her father. So when she wrote the book, Before the Living God, which is her autobiography, before she sent it to a publisher, she sent it to her father. So he gets it by post. In those days, he didn't have UPS and courier and so on. So she sent it by ordinary post to her father, said he got it one day, he read it, and the next day he drove to the convent to see her. And he said, now I understand. He said, I'm glad you wrote this, that now I understand. And they were reconciled from there on, and he became very supportive of her until he died. So that the book turned her father back towards, what Scripture says will turn the hearts of parents back towards their children. And said said if nobody else ever read the book and nothing else happened to the book, and the book was trashed by critics, that I didn't care. Said that book reconciled me with my father and helped my father understand my life. Okay. Her situation today, she's a happily retired prioress, still writing, and she still does a lot of direction for people literally around the world if you can get to see her, but it's a little like seeing a mafia chieftain, I have to describe how I got to see her. I was teaching a course on her in 1987, and I had to go to England in summer for some talks. And I was going to Mass daily at the chapel at the University of London. It was a Carmelite chaplain. So one day after Mass, he's investing. I went in and I said, you wouldn't happen to know how I could see Ruth Burroughs. And he almost dropped the chalice. He said, who? I said, he said, well, I could probably arrange that. And he gave me a phone number, and he said, that's not her name. I said, I didn't know that. But anyway, I phoned her, and within 5 minutes, we had set up a time, went to see her, and had a wonderful first, and there's been some wonderful visits since. A little bit about her temperament. She opens her famous autobiography with the line, I was born with a tortured complexity, and my life has been difficult because of that. See, so she is the same as Therese of Lisieux we saw this morning. These are not simple people. And I think sometimes we don't do ourselves a favor in spirituality by refusing to afford complexity to our spiritual figures. What do I mean by that? We refuse to afford complexity to our spiritual figures. Let me just give you some examples. Jesus, Mary, Mother Teresa. We can't afford them complexity, Try something sometime. Write an article and just say Jesus had a sexual temptation and see what happens to you. Okay. Yet, they say Jesus was tempted in every way that we were, except he didn't sin. And so was Mother Teresa, and so was Mary. And see, we can't read complexity, we can't read sexuality, we can't read sexual complexity into people. Our Christian piety just didn't let it. And so what do we have? We have statues, And then we can't afford complexity ourselves. And oftentimes, that's exactly what harms our happiness. So this psychologist said, she wrote that, how can she be happy? He said, that's why she is happy. It's when we're in denial. When, I won't face this, I won't face that, that we're not at peace. One of my professors in theology, who later became a bishop and a very fine one, he used to use this image, and it's very simple, and I much like it. He said, your soul or your heart, whatever, the depth of your being, he says, imagine yourself like a deep, deep ocean, okay? There are places where the ocean is 6 miles deep, okay? And where the ocean's that deep, like your psyche, your heart, he says, there can be a huge difference between the surface and the depth. See, sometimes the ocean, on the surface, it is choppy, and it'll break ships into half, and underneath, it's calm, solid, and still, and vice versa. Sometimes the surface is real still, and underneath there are currents that'll break you in half. That's the way our psyche is. Sometimes I can keep it together on the surface. I don't think about things, but then underneath, deep currents happen. People like Ruth Burroughs, they let the surface be choppy. When they're frustrated, they're frustrated. When they're sexually tense, they're sexually tense. When they're angry, and then the bottom stays still. Remember that wonderful line in Paul in 2 Corinthians. When he wrote 2 Corinthians, he was really undergoing a dark night. This was a very low time in his life, both ministerially and personally. Remember how he begins this book? At one point he says, right now, he says, my outer life is completely falling apart. He said, but inwardly I'm solid. Never been more solid in my life. See, sometimes it's the opposite. My outer life is perfect. Inwardly, I'm falling apart. So Ruth Burroughs has always been somebody who, since her mystical experience, which we'll talk about, her inner life is solid. Outer life, this, that, anger, almost got kicked out, and so on. That's also why, she owns her complexity, and she can own complexity and spirituality. That's why her books are also very mature books. She'll say stuff in her books that make you blink. As an example, she did that wonderful study on Thérèse of Lisieux on her photographs, and for many people, Thérèse of Lisieux is a China doll. You can't say, well, she's a loner, in every picture she's alone, and so on. Or she has another, in the same book, she writes about Teresa of Avila, who Ruth says was a saint and a wonderful woman. She said, and one of the most neurotic women who ever walked the planet, she calls it as it is, and you can be a saint and be neurotic. You can be a saint and be a loner, but see, we don't do that. No, Teresa of Avila, she might be perfect. I sometimes shock people with this. I said, let's look at some of the great people of our time. John Paul II, Mother Teresa. Do you think they had big egos? The size of the Grand Canyon plus, doesn't mean they weren't saints. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why they did such great work. What's wrong with most of us is we don't have enough ego. And I mean that in the best sense. For instance, John Paul could go in front of the whole world and say, it's 4 million people, I love you. And it's very important you hear that from me. You and I couldn't do that. Our tongue would break off. You'd say, who am I to tell the world or whatever? Or John Paul says, God kept me alive for the year 2000 because I was the person who had to lead the world through the millennium. It takes a heck of an ego to say that. Or Mother Teresa would walk in any room and she knew she was a very important spiritual, and they were right. Now, they weren't necessarily egotists, because remember, they said, no, this isn't me, this is God. God is working through me. I'm a humble servant. And they were. But notice, we can't do that, and consequently, oftentimes, we struggle spiritually with our self-image. And we get in all kinds of false humility and so on, which keeps us down, and that's why we don't do great things like John Paul or Mother Teresa. And oftentimes our spirituality books don't help. You want to read a Ruth Burroughs, just say, no, look at your ego. Or Richard Rohr writes wonderfully. And Richard Rohr says, during the first half of your life, and we're going to come back because his scheme and Ruth's are very similar, Richard Rohr says, during the second half of your life, success won't teach you anything anymore. And in fact, it can be harmful to you. It'll still feel good. But he said, during the first half of your life, success is very important because your self-image isn't handed to you on a platter, and so that the rules change. See, Ruth's complexity has made her a great spiritual writer because in her, you don't get China dolls, you don't get saccharine piety, you don't get denial, you get depth. And that comes from her own personality. Secondly, deep struggle. She'll write and she'll share that she's a happy woman. Today she's a very mature woman, very together woman, but that's the result of a deep struggle. From the 18-year-old airhead to the young nun who was near hysteria sometimes and almost got kicked out of convents and so on, lots of struggle. Pathological ordinariness. Now, it's interesting. Today, she's one of the gurus in mysticism. One of the things Ruth says in her books and says in her life is, I have been the most ordinary woman who's ever walked this planet. You're going to see mysticism is not so much about extraordinary experience. Mysticism is truly about touching and knowing the depth of the ordinary. This is not a woman who walks on water, This is a woman whom angels appear to. Talking about angels appearing to her. I love this text, like Teresa of Avila. Now, she had angels appear to her. In one of her books, Teresa shares how, said one day she was praying and this angel appeared, and Teresa was perplexed. She said, because I can normally tell the difference between a cherubim and a seraphim, and she couldn't tell, was this or that? So now that is sophisticated angelology, that if you know a cherubim from a seraphim, that means you have a pretty good deal going. Ruth Burroughs cannot tell the difference between a cherubim or a seraphim. No angel has ever appeared to her. She says, my life has been marked by the deep ordinary, okay? Then, restlessness, universal spirit, the same as, very similar to Therese in this sense. Here's a woman with an artistic temperament, with a writer's temperament, with a deep, restless spirit, who, well, she's been more than 50 miles from home, but not much, But like Therese has basically been shut away in a Carmel, in a convent, for her whole life, her whole adult life, and yet has been, that restlessness is there, and like Therese, single-minded. All this powerful restlessness, and yet at the same time she can will the one thing, and in that, find her own happiness and touch the world. So that, again, very much like Therese, the example of a life that can give itself over in trust. And for Burroughs, this trust was tough. It was hard for her, especially with her father saying, you're wasting your life. You're wasting your life. And the self-doubts about, I hide myself away at Carmel for the rest of my life. Like how do I make a contribution to the world? How do I do maternity? How do I become a mother? How do I, somehow mother the planet and be generative and give life when I'm tucked away in this Carmel, and so on. It takes great trust, especially if you're deeply, deeply driven by restlessness and the creative spirit and so on. And that's inside of her. And then she's mystical, but I want to define mysticism. This is the paradox that I want you to get, that on the one hand, she says, my life is marked by the pathological ordinary. So I'm just the most, I'm a person that nothing extraordinary ever happens to. Other people might have visions and, highs in prayer and so on. Ruth, and I'm just this, it's always the same, okay? Yet she becomes our contemporary guru on mysticism. Why? Well, I want to look at her definition of mysticism. Very important. more important even than her own vision of the mystic life and so on. I want to dwell on this, that her definition of mysticism, and it's the one I use, and I think it's one of the best functioning definitions of mysticism. Now notice what she says. Mysticism is being touched by God at a level that's deeper than language, thought, conceptualization, imagination, and feeling. It's quite a mouthful. You're touched by God in a way that you can't speak about, think about, imagine about, or feel. So how do you do that? Okay. It's knowing God without thinking, imagining, or feeling God. You're going to see, and that is mysticism. You're going to see mysticism is not at its root marked by extraordinary experience. Let's work that definition, and we're going to come back to her experience. Okay. I want to begin, I'm going to lead you through a tripartite explanation here. Now, I'm going to give you three images. You got to blend them in your head, in your minds, and then you got them. Okay. The first one comes from Scripture. And it's in John chapter 6. On John chapter 6, you have a very famous text where Jesus, and that's the breaking point of Christ's ministry in John's gospel. So that, in all the gospels, you have the same pattern where Jesus starts and he's very, very popular for a while. And then slowly the crowds leave, and by the time he dies on the cross, there's 2 people or 3 people under the cross. So it goes from the 5,000 to the 3. Now in John's gospel, it happens all at once. It happens on the basis of one homily. So John says Jesus was preaching, and he was the bread of life discourse in chapter 6. And at one point Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you won't have life within you." Now, these are Jews. They're hearing cannibalism. Jesus is saying, you got to eat my flesh, drink my blood. And John said, all the people walked away, all of them. And they said, this is intolerable language. We can't hear this. This is intolerable. So Jesus turns to the 12. We're standing there. And Jesus says, do you want to walk away too? And Peter, speaking for the 12, says, yes, we would. He says, in fact, we would like to, but we have no other place to go. Now, first of all, there's a lot of humility in that answer. That's not a throwaway answer. A lot of times in our lives, we stand at a place, there's a lot of biblical humility in saying, I don't have any other options, especially once you've invested a long time in a certain moral or, a certain religious option. He says, we've burned our bridges. And he's also implied in that there isn't any other place to go. See, sometimes, for instance, when we're in the church, we'd say, not all the faults of the church, but if you left it, there isn't any other church. Really, if you leave the church, you have no place to go. It's the only church there is. And any other church would have the same faults because they're our faults. Okay, so you say well, we don't particularly like what you're saying, but we haven't had any options. But then, this is the deeper part. Peter says, besides, we know that you have the words of eternal life. You have the words of everlasting life. Now, that's a stunning statement in this sense, that Peter has just heard Jesus saying something he doesn't understand and something he doesn't like, and that sounds like death. And he's saying, Jesus, today you sound like death, except I know at a different place that what you're saying brings life. Not today, I just know it at a different spot. Now, hang on to that. Second image, C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is maybe the best English Christian apologist we've ever produced. Certainly one of the top 2 or 3, But if you know C.S. Lewis's story, he wasn't always that. C.S. Lewis grew up as an atheist and almost an anti-Christian. And he was led to belief slowly in his life, very much through the influence of Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, and Davis, Charles Williams, Dorothy Sayers, Austin Farrer. There was a wonderful group of Christian intellectuals at Oxford at that time that he became friends with. They were all writers, and they were all very committed Christians. And slowly they boxed him in where he became a Christian. And he writes in his autobiography, which is a wonderful little book called Surprised by Joy. It's not Justin Bieber's My Life Up to Now. Okay. Sorry about Justin Bieber fans. Okay. This is a very, very mature autobiography. And he writes about the night when he first knelt down and confessed faith in Christ. And he said he had been out with Tolkien. And they had a dinner, and they had argued religion, and they walked around for some hours in Oxford and argued about religion and argued about Christ. He said, and I came home, I knew, he said, I knew the truth of it. I knew the truth of it. And then he said, I knelt down. For the first time in my life, I knelt down. But now listen to the words closely afterwards. He said, I knelt down the most reluctant convert in the history of Christendom. Notice he didn't kneel down and say, well, praise be Jesus, I found you. He said, I knelt down the most reluctant convert in the history of Christendom, but he said, I knelt down because I realized this. And this is a direct quote. He says, I had come to realize that the harshness of God is kinder than the softness of man, and God's compulsion is our liberation. The harshness of God is kinder than the softness of man, and God's compulsion is our liberation. What is God's compulsion? See, Lewis said, you know why I knelt down? Because I had to. I had to. Notice he's using the word compulsion. It's not even so much that it's even a free choice. We're going to get back to Ruth Burroughs' experience in a few minutes. Okay? Why did she become a nun? Because she had to. Okay? God's compulsion. What's God's compulsion? Now here, I have to warn you, there's going to be a bad word in there, but it's a good word. One of my mentors has been Daniel Berrigan, the Jesuit, who's now also in his 80s, late 80s. And I think it's been one of our spiritual mentors of our generation. And I remember I was still a very young priest when I heard this interview on television. And this woman was interviewing Daniel Berrigan, and she says, Father, she said, where does our faith reside? So I ask you this question. Where does our faith reside? Does it reside in the head or in the heart? So I ask you this question. Does faith reside in your head or your heart? And Berrigan said, ma'am, he said, faith is rarely where your head is at. He said, and faith is even less rarely where your heart is at. He said, faith is where your ass is at. And he said, I'm not trying to be cute with that. No, and notice he's going to nail it. He says, anybody who's been in any commitment for any length of time, in a relationship, a marriage, a church, a justice, a commitment, any kind of commitment, said, you know there are going to be days and seasons where your commitment looks like death. It doesn't look like life at all, but you stay there because you know that long range is going to bring you life. Your head isn't in it, your heart isn't in it, but you're in it. Why? Because another part of you knows. See, your head tells you what you think is wise. Your heart tells you what you would like to do. And another part of you, our gut, our soul, or when I talked about your moral center, it tells you what you have to do. You know, see, Peter, standing before Jesus, said, you don't make any sense, and I'd like to leave, except I know I can't. I know that this is going to bring me life. That's Ruth Burroughs in the chapel at 18. That's mystical experience. She says, I don't want to be a nun. I don't even want to be a Christian. But I know that's what I have to do. When I'm in touch with what my deep center is, that untouched part of us, that previously touched part that Therese massages, says, then I know what I have to do. I need to be a Carmelite nun. I need to be a contemplative. I need to do these things and so on. See, this is what I have to do. You know, there's a corollary point that I like to make to people. Because Burroughs is going to say, see, the essence of mysticism for us is to get in touch with that. You know, it's to get in touch beyond our feelings, beyond our theologies, beyond our ideologies, to get in touch with, like, who is the true me and what's underneath there, and you know, what do I know that I can't necessarily think, and so on. See, that's our mystical center. And our society doesn't help much with that. See, one of the other ways that deflects us from that is this question. I'll ask you, is this a good question if I say to you, are you happy in your life? Someone comes up to you and says, are you happy? Is that a good question? No, that's a question to torture yourself with, you know. You'll start thinking about it. Pretty soon you get tears in your eyes, and I don't think so, you know. Because it's the wrong question. Because, you know, if we understood happiness correctly, but not the way we understand it, but someone comes up to you and says, is there meaning in your life? Yeah, there's meaning. Some days I'm not particularly happy about it. You know, if you went up to Peter that day when Jesus gave that homily and said, you're happy being a follower of Jesus? He'd have said, no. Do you have to be a follower of Jesus? Yes. Or even more graphically, imagine Jesus on the cross. He's dying on the cross and someone comes and says, "Are you happy up there?" He'd say, "Today, no." And today particularly not. Is there meaning up there? Yes. See, and mysticism, Ruth Burroughs says, see, mysticism, we can know stuff that we can't think, articulate, or feel. So I just have to do this. Maybe our sense of intuition runs the closest, okay? But see, when she says we have to live mystically driven lives, which means don't operate so much out of your feeling, don't operate so much out of your head, operate out of, but you have to get into touch, really, because there's a lot of neurotic things can suggest that you have to do, But what do I have to do to be authentic, And for her, she knew she had to become a nun. Now, notice this wasn't an angelic experience. There were no angels. There were no levitations. It was just, she said, at 18, and it changed my life, she said, forever. And it's been a good life. Like Peter, it's brought her life, But she said, just in that moment of clarity in a chapel, in a boarding school in England, I realized, this is what I have to do. This is who I am. This is who God is. It's all, I do it, okay? Many of us in this room, if you look at the story of your vocation or why you're sitting here today, and if you boiled it down, it was much the same thing. And sometimes it kind of happens through circumstance or whatever, but that's the mystical life. Now, Burroughs says, most of the time, okay, she has an interesting expression. She said, this can happen lights on or lights off, See, mystics, the people who can write on this, of whom Ruth Burroughs is one, or John of the Cross, or even to a certain extent Henry Nouwen, Thomas Merton, mystics, the difference is they have this experience, but for them it's partly light on. They can kind of understand what's happening to them, and they can articulate it and articulate it and write it down. So most of us, it happens, it's light off. It's happening, and it's just as real, except you can't articulate it. Hopefully we live it out. You can make an analogy here to music, to art, and to so on, to beauty. So as an example, do artists necessarily have a deeper experience than you do? No. The difference is they can articulate it, and we can't. Mozart wasn't necessarily a really deep guy, but he had an exceptional talent. He could simply hear the music and write it. A novelist like Iris Murdoch, it wasn't that she was deeper than the rest of us. She just had an incredible mystical talent. She could look at things that you and I kind of know, but we can't articulate them, and she'll write a great classical novel. That's when some of the novelists, the great novelists, it's so real that people say that must be their own life. So, Iris Murdoch, her greatest novel was a novel called The Black Prince. She wrote it when she was 43 years old, and she wrote it out of the mind of a 58-year-old man. And it's so real that when you read it, you say, it's impossible that she made this up. You have to be a 58-year-old man and know the smells and the tastes and the stuff to do this. She was a 43-year-old woman. She was an artist. She was a mystic. She was a literary mystic. See, they can simply articulate that. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Thérèse of Lisieux, partly, and some of these, they were also deep people, but they were also artists. Like I said this morning, the difference between Thérèse of Lisieux and Anne Frank and millions of other people's diaries is they were great artists. And in that sense, they were mystics. They had the experience light on. We have the same experience, and when somebody else explains it to us, this is what happened to me. See, then our lights go on, Remember sometimes reading Henry Nouwen, it was like being introduced to yourself. Say, wow, I guess that's why I feel like I feel, He just laid it out there. And that's why great learning is not so much new to you, it's waking up to what you know. And in fact, in Buddhism, that's what the word mysticism means. A mystic means to wake up. To wake up, You already know it, you got to wake up to what you know, okay? Nikos Kazantzakis, the great Greek writer, tells a story when he was 19 years old and he spent the summer in a monastery. And he went to visit this old Father Macarius, who had a great reputation, spiritual figure. And he said he goes to see him. The very first time he went to see him, he says, the old priest came in, looked at him, he says, "Young man, what do you want?" As I said to him, "Well, I heard you're a spiritual figure, and I want you to give me some counsel. I thought you'd give me some advice, So I said, "Well, let me see." He said, he sat down, he said, took my knees. He said, and there wasn't much left of the old man except his eyes. He said, but by God, those eyes penetrated. He said, he looked at me for a long time, and he said, "Young man," he said, "I'll give you some advice." He said, "You're asleep. You're asleep." He said, "Now wake up. Wake up before death wakes you up, but you're asleep." See, in Buddhism, that's what their mysticism means. It means to wake up, to wake up. Burroughs would say the same thing, but except Burroughs says, mysticism is, it's there. It's the brand of God. It's the kiss of it. It's that previously touched part inside of which you know yourself. And see, in that sense, mysticism is a very ordinary experience. It's not, just people who are special and have mystical experience. People who are special either have the talent to explain it, or some of the mystics do have extraordinary experience. Sometimes very, very much later on in life, and so on. But that's not the essence of mysticism. That's why we're not necessarily all mystics, the same as we're not all artists, but we all have deep mystical experience. In fact, it's the most important experience of our lives. I was teaching a course one year on John of the Cross, and the first night I went around the room, I always asked, why are you taking this course? And, you get different answers and so on. And one woman surprised the class. She said, "I'm taking this class because I am a practicing mystic." Well, that raised some eyes. Okay. That's not a bad answer. Basically said, I'm trying to find out who I am, and I'm trying to, if you're doing spiritual direction, you're a practicing mystic. If you're praying, you're doing centering prayer, you're a practicing mystic. You're trying to touch that previously touched part of yourself. You're trying to get in touch. Who am I really underneath here? And Ruth Burroughs said, if you ever touch it, you don't have to touch it for long. God can change your life in 18 seconds, or 18 years, or however. But, and it's ordinary. It's not flash. It's kind of, and in fact, we're here, contemplative prayer. That is one part of the very essence of contemplative and centering prayer. It's just to sit and, to stop making our own effort and try to let God, let me hear it, let me somehow know it, let me know it underneath. I want to give you an image from John of the Cross, which Ruth is very keen on too, and that is how earlier on in the spiritual life, images are really important. And later on I'll give you some stuff from Thomas Keating on this too, and how later on it doesn't work through images, but it works, as John of the Cross says, at a certain point, all the deep things work beyond your own knowledge. So, when you read the stuff, you'd automatically say, "John, what are you talking about?" Okay, well, let me give you what this image means. Imagine this. I'm going to give you a human image, then we'll apply it to prayer. Imagine you have a mother, who's retired and is in an assisted living senior citizens home. And you are the dutiful son or daughter who happens to live 5 miles away. Your sister is conveniently living in Alaska, which is good for her. She wants to see her mom once a year and take care of her. But you do it 5 nights a week. Every night after work, you stop from between 5 and 6 o'clock, and you help your mother have her supper, and you talk about the day, and you get her adjusted for the night, and so on. And now, you're doing that 5 nights a week, regularly, year after year. During the course of a year, how many times do you think you'll have an exciting conversation with her? Once, twice in a good year? And what are you doing the other nights? You're talking about the weather, how she's feeling, did the kids come home, the terrible Jell-O she's eating, this, that, and so on. And you're looking at your watch 2 or 3 times, and at 6 o'clock you're going, did you have a good visit with her? Absolutely. Because at that level, it's not so important that you talk. You do this year after year, slowly you will get to know your mother more deeply than any person in the whole world. And your sister from Alaska, who does come home once a year, and her, your mother, they're crying and gushing, and they're great to see you, and they do have a deep conversation, because she only sees her once a year. That also happens with prayer. If you pray every 6 years, you're going to have a real deep experience. Jesus found me, it's wonderful, and so on. But you haven't been at church for 6 years, If you go twice a day for half an hour, after a while you're sitting, you're looking at your watch. But the deeper things are happening under the surface. See, at the beginning, the stuff happens on the surface. After a while, you know why you don't talk to your mother? Because there isn't anything to say. It's been said. Presence, you're there. In contemplative prayer, why do we stop with the images? Because they're done. You don't need them anymore. This is Thomas Keating's image. You all are familiar with it. When Keating defines centering prayer. So imagine this. He says, imagine the bottom of the ocean. You have a mother fish. You've heard the image, but I'm going to take it one step further. And one day the little baby fish come up to the mother and they say, Mother, tell us about water. What's water? Okay. Well, they're in it. They're swimming in it. So how can the mother, and they can't get out of it, okay? Now, this is where I'm going to improve on Keating's image, okay? Now imagine that the mother was a very sophisticated technological young fish. And she'd tell the fish, now sit down, and she'd bring down a PowerPoint, and she would do a PowerPoint presentation on water. This is Niagara Falls, this is a water tap running, this is the Pacific Ocean, this is the Atlantic Ocean, here's what a storm looks like, here's a lake, here's, this, all kinds of slides on water. And for a while, they'd be pretty excited. Now, the irony is they're sitting in water, and they're watching slides, which are digitized, they're not real water, and they're getting a nice image of water. But now back to Keating. Keating would say at a certain point, the mother fish turns the slides off. Said, look, there's no more sense watching them. First of all, they're not water. Those are images. Same as Scripture. You know what the Bible is? It's not God. It's a PowerPoint presentation about God. And so is every statue and lords and everything else. What I'm talking about today, these are little PowerPoint presentations. They're not God. So centering prayer and Burroughs that said, at a certain point said, turn off the projector. Just turn it off, okay? And now you're sitting in the water. Let it flow through you. And some will have dirt in it, some will have seaweed, some will be clear, so, and you're just sitting in the water, okay? Burroughs would be very strong on that. In fact, when we look at her scheme, which we'll look at here in a minute, said there comes a time when it's really important in the spiritual life to turn off the projector. Now, at the beginning, it's very important you turn it on. For instance, John of the Cross is real clear. He says, you do discursive prayer until you reach a certain level. You talk to your mother and you try to talk to her about deep things until you reach a certain level. Then you turn the projector off. You just talk about Jell-O and supper and you're just with her. And the deep things then happen under the surface. Now, for Burroughs, see, the deep thing is always under the surface. To my mind, for me, it's the best definition of mysticism I've run into. It's real. And it changed her life. It changes our lives. Mysticism is being, or I'll give you that last line, it's knowing God without thinking, imagining, or feeling. It's also a great definition of centering prayer and contemplative prayer. It's praying without thinking, without imagination, without feeling. You're just there. You're trying to be in touch with what's underneath there. You're trying to know. One of my prayer words when I do centering prayers, and I know I'm only supposed to use one or two words, but I still love that text, be still and know that I am God. And sometimes just work at the word know. I just want to sit here and I want to know God. That's what I know. Not think, not feel, just, you know something. Okay. When you're with your mother and you're just there. You don't have to be talking. You don't have to say to them, Mom, now tell me again about how you met Dad and when I was born and how did you feel about birth and so on. You've done that. Let's pull out the photo albums and go through them one more time, how precious I was as a kid to you and so on. You've done that. Now it's just, God, that Jell-O is awful, and how do you put up with that every day and so on, and you're looking at your watch 3 times, but you're with your mother. Okay, beyond images. You're knowing your mother. Okay, now, I want to do this briefly. I used to teach a course on this, but Burroughs herself isn't so excited about this anymore. I think her real contribution is the things she does in mysticism, but in the book, Guidelines for Mystical Prayer, she actually lays out a mystical schema, which is very, it uses Carmelite language, but it's different than the Carmelites. me do a little bit of background to this, and then we're going to do her schema briefly. I don't have a whole lot of time left here, but let me at least introduce this. You know, the Carmelite, let me give you John of the Cross in layman's terms, but accurately, okay? For John of the Cross, and I think he's one of the great structural, spiritual writers who's ever walked this planet, maybe the best one in Christianity. And John of the Cross says there are 3 distinct phases to the spiritual life, okay? And he would call them, you're a beginner, okay? And for him, that is the dark night of the senses. But I'll put my own language to it. For John of the Cross, that's essential discipleship. Essential discipleship, and it's the struggle to get your life together. I'll just use that language. Essential discipleship, the struggle to get your life together, okay? Then you move to the second phase that him and the mystics call proficiency. And proficiency is the struggle to give your life away. Notice as a young person, we have all these questions. Who am I? What do I mean? Who loves me? Who will marry me? Where will I live? So on. That's a valid struggle. It's a struggle to get your life together. And will I have children? Where will I live? What will be my career? And how will I finance and pay for it and so on? That's the struggle to get your life together. That's the struggle for essential discipleship. See, then, I would hope that most of us, maybe all of us in this room, are in a proficient stage where our biggest question is no longer, how do I get my life together, but how do I give my life away? Whatever I'm doing, how do I do it more purely, more deeply, more generously, more creatively, more generatively? You know, like, how do I become a better priest or a better mother, a better professor, a better human being, a better uncle, a better aunt, a better whatever? See, so it's no longer so much about me. It's how do I do this better for the world? Okay? And that is what John of the Cross and the mystics call proficiency. And then you have radical discipleship. And that's the dark night of the spirit in John of the Cross. And that is, how do I give my death away? Which is very different than how to give my life away. See, right now our question is, how do I live properly? How do I live more generatively? Someday for each of us, the question is going to be, how do I die properly? How do I exit this planet so that my death becomes a grace and a gift? Not even particular for me, but for the world, my family, the church, and so on. And for John of the Cross, that's the night of the Spirit. Now, I use those categories, and I sometimes work with Richard Rohr, and Richard doesn't use those categories, okay? And I like his categories too. Richard works with 2, and Ruth Burrs is going to be closer to Richard Rohr than to John of the Cross. With her islands, the 3 islands, basically her schema of the first 2 islands fits more Richard's schema of spirituality in the 2 halves of life. So that the first half of life is the first island, the second half of life is the second island. Richard doesn't necessarily talk about the third island, which is what John of the Cross would call the living flame experience, which is already post Dark Night of the Spirit. So that her schema, I'm not going to run through it because we don't have a lot of time, but and also, you know, I was so excited when I taught this, and oftentimes when I teach it in detail, students get really excited about this. They really like the detail. You can pick up all the detail in her book, Guidelines for Mystical Prayer. Ruth said, I developed that when I was young. She said, I'm not so excited about it. She said, so, she said, I'm probably never going to develop this, and so on. But she did, at one stage, when she was younger, lay out her own mystical vision, the way John of the Cross does, the way Teresa of Avila does with, you know, the mansions and so on. But for her, she talks about 3 islands. And very succinctly, the first island is basically what Richard Rohr would call the first half of our lives. And that's not the first half chronologically. That's really until late generativity. That means your initial quest for life and your initial maturity. You know, when you're a young parent, when you're a young priest and you're already mature and you're doing it right and so on, as opposed to what tracks in when we get to be 50 and 55 and 60 perhaps, where you start, or sometimes it works earlier, where you start saying, I'm doing this, but there's more, and you start, he says, then you cross the bridge and you enter the second island, okay? And it's interesting, he said, you know how, he said, you never find the bridge. You can't see the bridge. You have to be taken there, and you have to be taken there by mystical experience, which means at a certain point in centering Pearl River, you discover the same as she was taken to a convent by mystical experience. At a certain point, her gut said, Ruth, you got to do this. Rachel, you got to do this. See, so we can be pretty mature, and at a certain point, something inside of us is going to say, you know, it's time for the next step. You've got to move to the next level, what Richard would call the second half of life, you know, in which our values change. We begin to look more deeply. You begin to stare more realistically at your mortality, that say, I'm not going to be on this planet forever. You know, simply a deeper maturity sets in. And so she said in the second island, she says, you never rest. Like, she has a wonderful image. She said, on the first island, she says, the sun is always shining, at least you think it is, and there's caves you can go into. Caves are bars and other things, that, you know, where you can go in for a respite. But she said, if you see the island from above, so you're on an airplane, you would see that it's actually covered by mist. We think we're living in sun, but we're not. She said, on the second island, the sun is there and it's unrelenting. You know, truth is shining on you and you can't escape it. You know, it's burning you, okay? Then she said, it's interesting for her how you get to the third island. She said, there is no bridge. I should have brought you a diagram, but I had made it myself by hand and I was humbled by it. I didn't think, I'm not an artist, okay. So you can make your own islands, you know. So the first one is wide. The second one, he said, is more like a road. It's not so much you don't live on the second island, you cross it. And there's a bridge between the first and the second. Then the third island is out in the ocean. You don't cross it. You don't go there by bridge. So you know how you get there? And I love this image. So you know how you move from maturity to ultimate maturity. It says, you wade in. It says, imagine, you know, you've crossed, and here's an island. I mean, and you see an island out there, but there's deep water between you and it. And she said, you start wading in, and you get scared, you go back to safety. You start wading in, you get scared, you go back to safety. She said, and one day you just wade in, and you let it take you. And it's the way we're going to get to heaven. You know, we're mature, and we start testing and moving, and one day she said, you're just going to let go, and it's going to take you there. And that's the island of eternity and so on. And that'll happen, said, during the second half of your life, to use Richard's terminology. The time where you start testing the waters. How deep can I go? How can I let myself go? Can I really, she asked the question, one of trust. Can I trust it so much? Can I trust it so much? And said, and one day you'll just let yourself float. Said, but oftentimes you'll go in, you'll test it, you'll come back to safety. You'll go in, test it, come back to safety. Said, one day you'll let it go. Or the waves can carry you. So there's two parts to this image. And most likely for most of that's what's going to happen. That's what John of the Cross calls conscriptive entry. And that is, John of the Cross says there's two ways you can enter the deepest part of your life. You can do it voluntarily, or you can have a stroke. You can have a heart attack. You can walk in your doctor's office, you got terminal cancer. That'll do it. Then you start drifting. You know, your security's finished. So the waves can take you. Now, all the mystics, John of the Cross, Teresa, and Ruth would say, try to do this before it's done to you. See if you can let yourself float in trust, and just blind trust before you have to do it because of cancer or a stroke or, you know, some physical debilitation or just losses in our lives. Let me end on this story from Ruth, but it's a great story, mystical story about how God does that to us. I was recently at a funeral of he was the father of one of our priests. And on the surface, he was a wonderful man, but he was really one of these strong men that you order from a catalog, you know. He was the father of 10 kids, solidly Catholic, very successful in terms financially, raised a big family, gave a lot of money to philanthropy, took care of his employees and took care of everybody, but very, very much in charge, you know. And so he died at age 90. We all went to his funeral, and his son, who was a priest, delivered this wonderful homily. So his son said, well, he said, we're burying my father, and he's 90 years old. He said, now, he beat the scriptural odds. See, because Scripture says 70 is the sum of a man's years, 80 for those who are strong. He said, now our dad got to live 90 years. He said, like, why the extra 10 years, even though he was strong? He said, well, it's not a mystery. He said, he was too cantankerous to die at 80. He said, it took God another 10 years to mellow him out. He said, and he did. He said during the last 10 years of his life, he said he had a lot of major diminishments. His wife died, he never recovered. He had a stroke and never recovered, and this happened, that happened. He said he began to lose everything. He said, so when he died, he said he could take your hand and he could hold it and he could say, help me. He said he couldn't do that since he was 3 years old. He said he was ready for heaven. So when he woke up on the other side, he said, help me, and I can help him into heaven. He said, before that, he was just too strong. See, he wasn't letting himself go. Ruth Burroughs would say, like, when you get older, you got to wade into the water, and you got to put your hand out, and at a certain point, trust that God's going to take it. And if you don't do it voluntarily, God will arrange that, that by the time you die, you're going to say, you know, help me. I can't do it. I can't do it. And that gets us to the third island. I just invite you to with her, I just want to introduce you to her, tell you this is an intriguing woman. She's still alive. She's still writing. Find some of her other books. She's a Carmelite. She's coming solidly out of that tradition, putting her own little spin to it, and so on. But it's particularly important, mystical writer. And I think somebody who can help, especially those of you who are doing contemplative prayer and contemplative outreach and centering prayer, her theology and spirituality fits perfectly with this. You know, that she's so clear that you reach a point, which is also very, very clear in the Carmelite tradition. In John of the Cross, John is really clear. There comes a time, and it's really when you mature in the spiritual life, that the time is for prayer without the icons, prayer without the images, where precisely you sit. You know, or to use Keating's thing, where you turn the PowerPoint off, because that isn't God, you know. Images aren't God. Icons aren't God. Even Scripture isn't God. They're PowerPoint, and they're wonderful. They're presentations about God. So centering prayer, contemplative prayer is just sit. Turn the projector off, and Ruth Burroughs says, then you're a practicing mystic. You know, notice when this happened to her, there were no images. She was sitting in chapel as a naughty 18-year-old girl, and in a moment of clarity realized, this is who I am. This is who God is. I can't even think it, I just know it. And I want to become a Carmelite nun, and I'm going to, at the time she didn't think I'm going to become a spiritual author, just I want to go where this takes me. And it took her a long ways, and it's still taking her a long ways. So anyway, that's Ruth Burroughs, and I'm going to get Kathy to come up and give us the next instructions. Okay.
So at this point, if you need a stretch break for about 5 minutes, there is still some water and I think some cookies in that other room if you just want to grab something, but come back quickly, just 5-10 minutes, all right? And then we're going to go forward with questions. So let's think about some insights, comments, something that struck you this morning, something you might like Father Ron to explain in a little bit more depth. And we have one person over here who's ready to go.
Then I'll pass it to you, shall I? I know you had to rush through your outline, but I wanted to know about this faults and things after conversion. Oh, it's just first conversion. Okay, well, yeah.
Okay, let me comment that briefly. That's a good point. What Ruth Burroughs does in her book, Guidelines for Mystical Prayer, she does something that the classical mystics do and do well, okay? So for instance, if you read John of the Cross, John of the Cross will have this. He'll say, they'll take the famous 7 deadly sins, or what we call them capital sins, you know, or faults, and they'll say, this is the way these things manifest themselves prior to initial conversion. So they're in crass forms. So prior to initial conversion, gluttony means you eat too much. Lust means you have illicit sex, you know. Envy means you're jealous of people and so on. But now, they don't go away. So then they said, once you are converted, you become mature and religious, you still have those faults, except they begin to manifest themselves in very different ways. So let me give you just a crass example. You know, take pride. So before I'm initially converted, I can be full of myself. Say, for instance, a singer might say, I'm a rock star, or like the Beatles, I'm bigger than Jesus Christ, and so on. Well, none of us in this room are that crass. We're not going to be proud and so on that. But then you start practicing centering prayer, and you say, I feel pretty good about myself, And then we become like the Pharisee and the publican. At least, thank God I'm not like the Beatles, And see, so that all the faults remain, except they take on much subtler forms. So, for instance, one of them that really, struck me, she said, we get into social justice, which is a wonderful thing. The gospel say, get into social justice. And then, we're writing articles about the poor, we're visiting the poor, we're doing this and that. She said, in fact, a lot of people don't really care about the poor. They care about how they feel about the poor. She said, not a lot of people are actually helping the poor. It helps my CV, So, for instance, if I say, in fact, we went through that as an Albany community in Edmonton. We had a seminary community, but we were living in St. Albert, which is a very affluent suburb of Edmonton, So I said, no, we got to be living downtown on Boyle Street, where the poor are, and then we would teach and study from there. And then, see, if Ruth Burroughs had been our spiritual lecturer, I'd say, so you live down there, said, would you actually be doing anything for the poor, or would you be doing something for yourself? So now you'd feel good about yourself. Say, I'm actually living with the poor. You may not be helping them at all. See, so she said, these faults, they stay, and in fact, she has a wonderful chapter in Guidelines for Mystical Prayer, in which she takes up and says, this is the way you're going to experience these things when you're mature. When you're immature, you just experience them in very crass forms. It's one of the things I like about little kids, like small kids. They have no subtlety. So one kid is playing with a toy, the other kid wants it, goes over, snatches the toy, and pushes the kid over and walks away, And the other kid starts howling, I said, that's honesty. See, we're real subtle and so on. We're going to get the toy, but, so she says, like faults, and John of the Cross that does this well, where he says, this is what your faults look like before you're mature. And this is how your faults look like after you're mature. They're still there, but they're more subtle and they're more nuanced. And they try to make you see them, a little bit like the function of the Enneagram. The Enneagram is not so much even for self-understanding. It's to flush out. It's a confessional tool. What are my faults? What are the things inside of me that I'm blind to, So, for instance, if I'm a 2, I can delude myself that I'm Mother Teresa. When in fact, I'm maybe just, doing things that serve me, and so on. So that's the value of that chapter. It's wonderfully done. Back there is a question. Okay.
I wanted to ask about, on your outline also, point number 2. You skipped over, and I'm fascinated by the 2 mystical companions.
Okay, good question. I'm sorry I missed that. I just wasn't looking at my outline. In fact, I wasn't looking at much, but anyway. Sometimes when you only have an hour to do something, you just try to cover too much. When she starts the introduction to Guidelines for Mystical Prayer, she talks about her 2 mystical companions. She calls them Claire and Petra. She said, I have Claire and Petra, and they're my mystical companions, and I talk to them and so on. And I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I know who they are, okay? And actually, you would know who one of them is. But have you ever seen the art critic, Sister Wendy Beckett? Who's, first of all, she's a marvelous artist and so on. That is one of the 2. And the other one is also a very famous British spiritual writer, Delia Smith. If you're in England, she is the Martha Stewart of England without the other thing that Martha Stewart had to go through. Okay? But Delia Smith is the most famous cookery writer and television personality in all of England. Okay, and has made millions and owns a football team and all kinds of stuff, but is also a wonderfully deep Catholic spiritual mind, and has written some of her own spiritual books, and those are Ruth's 2 mystical companions. They're both very famous women in England and worldwide, but Sister Wendy lives. Sister Wendy is not. She's a professed sister, but not to a congregation. She has private vows, wears a habit, and lives on the property. So does all the exercises with the Carmelite nuns. So she lives in a hermitage, and she wears the full religious habit and is always with the nuns, other when she's traveling and doing her work. And her money helps support the nuns, and is also a marvelous, marvelous woman. And so she is one of the ones, and the other one is Delia, who has written some wonderful spiritual books. She's also made millions of dollars, which she's used wisely, writing cookery books and doing national television programs. For whom, incidentally, I personally owe a huge, huge debt to, because when I was a young, undiscovered writer, Delia Smith took my books, took them to Hodder and Stoughton, took them to Doubleday in New York, and so on, and she broke me in to the publishing world at a level I'd never have gotten there without her help. She just became convinced that I should be heard, and so she took my writings when I was an unknown. Now I'm still an unknown, but less unknown. Okay. So I do owe a huge debt to Delia.
Yes, I was wondering if during our centering group, someone brought an article long article on that Constance Fitzgerald wrote on impasse, and I just find her absolutely phenomenal. And I was wondering if you have knowledge of her. I find that what you're saying has a lot. I read more about her and what she's written, and she writes about impasse, and we get to that impasse. Either, it happens to us or get there on our own, and there are no exits. And then that's when the right brain kicks in, and there are answers come intuitively over a period of time. And I kept thinking about that as you were talking about the artistry of the mystics, and that I had something happen to me where I had a brain injury on the left side. So that kind of kicked in the right brain and had me understand Constance Fitzgerald a little better. But as a Carmelite nun, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about her.
To be honest, I mean, you've fired my curiosity, but I haven't read Constance Fitzgerald. And is she a Carmelite nun? Yes. Okay, well, I will look her up. That's and is she an American, British, African?
Maryland. I think she's in Maryland.
Okay. Thanks. I will definitely, but I haven't read her, so I will. Let me tip you off, since we're exchanging names here, there's a young Carmelite in England, a man called Ian Matthew. And if you can find his stuff, he is truly worth reading, I think who's becoming one of the great expositors of John of the Cross and the Carmelite tradition. He's a brilliant young fellow and a very fine young man, We've been trying to get him to come to our school and do some workshops, but as a true monk, he doesn't want to travel a lot either. He wants to stay home and contemplate. Okay. Questions? Okay. Okay, whoever's got the microphone. Okay. But is there another microphone floating around here somewhere? Okay.
I just have a quick question, I think. On your outline here, signs we are on the island. Number 5, wearing of earthly things. Wearing of earthly things, right here.
Okay. Yeah, I got it. Okay.
You got it?
Weary of number 5. Second.
Number 5.
Let me get this here. I still haven't got it. Oh, no, okay, number 5 on top of page 3, okay. Yes. In fact, that is classical Carmelite spirituality. For John of the Cross, and you have to be careful how you define that. First of all, I want to link it with the word above it, which is the John of the Cross word directly. John of the Cross is one of the signs that you are in the dark night of the soul, or a dark night and not in psychological depression or infidelity, is solicitousness. Okay? Now, solicitousness, that's a good word, and it's a good English word. Solicitous means healthy anxiety. See, that as opposed to neurotic anxiety. John Shea, the Chicago John Shea, has a wonderful little soundbite on that. John Shea says, how do you know whether you're worrying healthily or unhealthily? He said, well, very simply this. He says, it's the difference between worrying Christ's kingdom to birth or worrying yourself to death. You know, see, healthy solicitousness means you're worried about the kingdom. Your anxiety is about Christ, about justice, about so on. Unhealthy anxiety is you're worried about yourself. See, oh, me, and I'm hurting this, and so on. So the difference between worrying God's kingdom to birth, worrying yourself to death. See, so John says, in a depression or an infidelity, you're worrying, and you actually grow weary of the world, but you grow weary of it for the wrong reason. Okay? See, so for instance, let me just give this very crassly, you know. I was once counseling a man, and he was having affairs outside of marriage with 2 different women at the same time. And this was collapsing on him, and he was almost suicidally depressed. He says, I think I'm in a dark night. I said, no, you're not. I said, don't be flattering yourself, you know. No, he was weary. He was literally, you know, sometimes thinking, I'm just sick of everything. Well, no, see, that was because of himself. See, so that's weariness of creatures for the wrong reason, because you're either depressed or you're unfaithful or whatever, and so on. It's sometimes, you know, suicidal depression, which is a psychological illness. You know, people can be so weary of the world and their lives that they kill themselves, and that's just an illness. And it can be biochemical or psychological. When John of the Cross means it here, it's got to be attached to the word above it, or Ruth Burroughs. There's a healthy anxiety about the world, and because of that, you grow weary of the world, which means, I'm going to give you some trite examples in a few minutes. I think you're all weary of the world in a healthy sense, you know, where things of the world, some of the things that excite other people don't excite you. So suddenly, you know, Survivor and American Idol and stuff, you know, they don't become big things on your plate like, I can't sleep, who's going to get voted off, and so on. And you have much, much deeper and bigger things. So there's a certain weariness of the entertainment industry, of this, of that, and so on, which is predicated on bigger worries, you know. You know, that's all these problems and stuff, and you're worried about Survivor. I'd like to use another one, but you may stone me to death. And you're worried whether you know, the Celtics going to win tonight. no, that's in a different league. Sorry, that one. I'll withdraw that one. You know, but I mean, where you start getting weary of certain things that used to excite you. You know, or you know, will I get to Vegas this year for my annual vacation or not? And say, well, I'd like to. It really doesn't matter. See, where you basically you're frying bigger fish. And you have much deeper worries than who wins Survivor or American Idol and so on. And so that's what he means. But it's a healthy weariness. There's an unhealthy weariness that's triggered by either psychological depression or any kind of clinical depression or by infidelity. You know, Hitler also killed himself. He was weary of the world, but not for good, solicitous reasons. But an excellent question. Questions? Who's got? And take the one back there too. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Can you talk about a few distinctives of Carmelite spirituality?
Okay. Can I talk about a few distinctives about Carmelite spirituality? Yeah. Let me point a few out. Okay. That are clearly distinctive. Important ones. There's many. And I'll make a confession that I'm biased for the Carmelite tradition. I've studied a lot more than the other traditions. I like the other traditions too. So for instance, the Ignatian tradition. But let me give you a few unique things about the Carmelite tradition. The Carmelite tradition, for instance, more so than the Ignatian tradition, and I'm sorry I'm on a Jesuit campus here, but is much, much more intuitive, less analytical. So John of the Cross was a poet. John of the Cross was a mystic, and so on. Ruth Burroughs, they're a mystic. They're lovers, so that they're much more intuitive. And so they're much less analytical. So I'll give you an example of that. If you have a Jesuit or an Ignatian spiritual director, you know, and I like them too, okay? No, I mean, it's a different way of doing it. And you come and you have to make a difficult decision. Well, they're going to lead you through a process of discernment, and you might make some lists, and then you see, can I live with this? And you change the list, and you do this. A Carmelite director won't do that. A Carmelite director will try to dispose you properly, which a Jesuit will also do too, and then the Carmelite director will say this: now, you go into the stillest hour of your night, and you decide what you have to do. You don't need a list. Just try to listen to what God's going to say. See, that's the way a poet does it. Ignatius was a wonderful structural military man, and he says, well, there's ways the army does these things, and so on. And they're valid too. So they're much more intuitive. Secondly, the Carmelite tradition is much more, not that one's right or one's wrong, but they are much more in the classical, in fact, maybe that's why they call it the classical. But for instance, if you're doing centering prayer and you're contrasting that to discursive prayer or meditative prayer, the Carmelite categories are much more like the categories, for instance, of Thomas Keating, whereas the Jesuits use those categories differently. Not that they're against Ignatian prayer or other traditions, so that, for instance, in Ignatian spirituality, what John of the Cross calls contemplation, or Carmelites, is actually, when they use the word contemplation, it's the same as what John uses for the word meditation, okay? So John would be much, or the Carmelite tradition would be much closer to, and again, it's not that one's right or one's wrong, there's different ways of formatting it. And he formats it in the Carmelite tradition. Treese, all the Carmelites follow that. They format it much more that there's this very clear distinction between meditation and contemplation. And for John of the Cross and the Carmelite tradition, meditation are all the forms of discursive prayer and effective prayer, devotional prayer, and so on. And then contemplation is very clearly what Keating would call centering prayer. And they're much clearer on the rules, where, for instance, with an Ignatian director, and again, I'm not saying who's right or wrong, there'd be more fluidity as to when you use them. If you had a clear Carmelite director, with coming out of the Carmelite tradition, they'd be very clear. There's a time where you stop using meditative prayer and you use contemplative prayer. And there's also, you don't start before a certain point. There's very clear rules. But I think the deepest difference would be, and again, because there's two temperaments, it's much more intuitively based. Whereas Ignatius would be more analytically based, and it's also very powerful. And in that sense, to give the Jesuits full credit, what came out of St. Ignatius wasn't as much of a mystical tradition. What came out of him, he had the most structural influence on the church. Today there are 28 major prestigious universities in this country, including this one, that are Jesuit. Ignatius was a structural, organizational genius. There aren't 28 major Carmelite universities in this country. There's a lot of Carmelite houses of prayer and so on. Or, for instance, religious life since Ignatius, with the exception of the earlier traditions like the Franciscans and the Carmelites and the Benedictines and Dominicans, but all of the rest of us were all very clearly based on St. Ignatius. I remember once being in a class with Robert Moore, and this woman said, Dr. Moore says, is it true that even women's religious orders are structured on the military archetype because of St. Ignatius? And he said, well, they do have mother generals, if that tells you something. Okay, see. That was Ignatius' powerful structural influence on Western science. And the Jesuits are far and away the most powerful order. Like for instance, right now, you have 28 wonderful, prestigious universities here in the United States. See, that's the genius of, that's not intuitively based. That's structurally based. Whereas the Carmelites, in some sense, are, I don't want to say dominate, but that tradition really, really strongly influences spirituality, and always will. So I think it's the intuitive, the analytical, and then other things shake out. But it's a good question. That would be the biggest, to my mind, biggest difference. Okay. Good question.
Yeah.
Somebody back there, and then we'll take one
The
here.
microphone here.
Okay.
I wanted to ask about the third island. You say on the third island, number 5, you get there by wading beyond your depth. And I was wondering if you could give an example or two. I'm not clear what that means.
You get there by wading beyond your depth. Okay, that's a metaphor. And the metaphors ask to be unpackaged. Okay. Let's just take some of our own language and stretch it, you know. See, we talk about, and you'll get this, you know, we all will get this. We talk about, you sometimes need to do experiences that stretch us. So I think we're pretty clear, like, you know, they say, well, I'm out of my comfort zone here, but, you know, someone says, do this, it's going to stretch me, it's going to stretch me. Now, this is that plus, which means you don't just do an experience that stretches you, you do an experience that transforms you or makes you let go of your old life in a radical way. Now, I can explain it to you conscriptively, then we can draw a parallel. For instance, that's exactly what a major illness or a stroke or cancer or something will do to you. You know, you're going along for 60 years and, you know, you've had appendicitis and you've had this and you've had that and you've always been healthy, and then you have a stroke. Okay? See, that doesn't just stretch you, it changes your life fundamentally, you know? See, now, that's conscriptively, it does it to us. Again, speaking for the Carmelites, she's a Carmelite. John of the Cross would say, when you reach a certain age, and Richard Rohr is going to say this too, in terms of the second half of life, you might come to a point in your life where you say, like, I don't want to wait to have a stroke. I don't want to wait to have a cancer diagnosis or something. I want to do this on my own. I want to do something that is just not just going to stretch me, it's just going to change my life completely. So how would that look like? Well, I don't know, but I'll give you an off-the-cuff kind of an example. This is my classical one I use in class. Let's imagine a couple, John and Martha, and they're married, and they're just two wonderful people. They're 75 years old. The kids are raised. They love their grandkids. They're involved in their parish. They're doing RCIA. You know, they have nice vacations every year, and they're this wonderful Christian couple. And they go and see their priest or spiritual director one day and said, you know, we've been praying the Abraham-Sarah text, and how when Sarah was 70 and Abraham was 80, God appeared to them and said, I want you to go to a different country, a different place where you don't know where you're going. It's going to take you 10 years to get there, and then Sarah's going to get pregnant, whatever that means, you know. And we want to do that. So we're going to sell our house and give the money to the food bank. We're not going to put it in the bank, you know, because we're not coming back. And Jesus said, give your money to the poor. We're going to do this. And we're going to go, and we've bought one-way tickets, and we're going to become missionaries to Islam in Pakistan. And we don't know anything about it. We can't even spell Al-Qaeda, but we're going to go there, and we're going to do this. And suppose they actually did it. They wouldn't just be stretching themselves. They would be fundamentally letting go of life as they knew it. Okay. Now, it's interesting. Both Ruth Burroughs and John of the Cross would say, if they take two-way tickets, they're not doing it. They're just doing a new form of generativity. Because they said, if we don't like it, we'll come back. You know? See, when you check into palliative care, have a stroke, you don't say, if I don't like the stroke, I'll reverse it, you know? So it's got to be one way. See, now, that doesn't just stretch you. That changes you. It changes fundamentally the securities of your life, where you say, I got to do this in such a way that I trust God, that this is what I should be doing. See, and that is what John of the Cross calls the dark night of the spirit. In the dark night of the spirit, it's more like Kierkegaard said, you jump off a cliff. And even if you change your mind, it doesn't matter. Halfway down, you can't say, I don't think I should have done this. You've done it, you know. And so it's that kind of, it's more than stretching. I mean, and you know, when we stretch, that's what Burroughs would mean. We wait out. You know, I'm going to see how far I can go. This may be a little beyond my safety thing, but I come back in, see. And she said, practice that, and one day simply let go. Get on the plane, go to Pakistan with a one-way ticket, and be a missionary to Islam. That's an image. I don't know what it means. Incidentally, I'm convinced that you know what we need in terms of spirituality today? Because we don't have spirituality developed, and we don't have, they do it in religious communities by and large, you know, to a certain extent, but even there, for the rest of us and so on, we don't have a spirituality for the last part of our lives, and we don't have support. So what we would need is what, you know, Hinduism has what they call forest-dwelling schools. So that, see, in Hinduism, at about time you become a grandparent, they say then your life should change. Then you should go and become a forest dweller, which means you go like on a prolonged retreat somewhere with other people, with spiritual direction, and you decide, what am I going to do with the last chapter of my life? You know, am I just going to golf in Phoenix until I can't anymore? Or go to Florida, which you do here? Remember Jerry Seinfeld said, my parents moved to Florida. He said they didn't want to, but they turned 65, and that's the law. Okay. Okay. See, what do we do with the, you know, that those last years of our life, which can still be generative? So usually what we do is we simply hang on. So as a priest, I'll say, well, I'll keep saying masses till I have my stroke, you know, and I'm useful, I can do this, and so on. I'll just keep doing what I'm doing, and you can do that, or I'm just going to be a grandparent, I'm going to be useful to the parish, and so on until I go into assisted living. A great line on this, that the parents of my provincial back in Canada, they're in their late 70s, and they were talking last summer about, and the man was saying to the husband how he dreads one of these years they have to go into assisted living. And his wife said, it'll be no adjustment for you. She said, you've had it for 50 years, okay. Okay. But see, so we need a spirituality. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we had, whatever you call them, forest-dwelling schools? So you turn to 75 and John and Martha could go to school somewhere, you know, some retreat center or something for a year or two, do intense direction and work out. What does Pakistan going to mean for us? How are we going to launch ourselves to the third island? And John of the Cross would say they wouldn't be doing that for themselves. They would be doing that for their kids and for the world. You know, imagine if John and Martha actually did that and went to Pakistan and died there. What do you think their kids would say about them 20 years after they're dead? They'd say, we had great parents. Our parents were unique, you know. They became missionaries at 75. You know, what kind of a legacy you would leave to your kids and to the church and so on. So it's not, you don't do this for yourself, you do it for the world. Great question. Okay, there's a, okay. Somebody there, okay. And then okay. You're going to get the last question.
And it's a very bad question, kindergarten question. I have a lot of atheists and agnostic friends. Okay, since God is so elusive, so invisible, so maddeningly evasive, how can I recommend God to them?
Good question. I hope I can repeat it correctly. If God is so elusive, so maddeningly elusive, but it's quite poetic actually, you know. Now, so maddeningly elusive and so on, so hidden, how can we recommend him to our atheist friends? I'm going to answer this gently. That's a good question. But I'm going to give you a biblical answer, then Philip once asked that question to Jesus. Remember, Philip goes up to Jesus and said, when are you going to show us the Father? And Jesus said, Philip, you mean you've been with me this whole time? You ask a question like that? Okay, so you're in good company. Okay. God isn't hidden. I may give you the image that Jesus answers with, and I'll try to answer it. You remember what Jesus said to Philip? He says, take the fig tree as your parable. When its leaves grow green, then you know that summer is here. Today is a beautiful, beautiful June day. Imagine if somebody walked out on the lawn here today and said, when are you going to show me summer? You'd say, well, you mean you're looking at all this, trees and all this blah, and you're going to ask what summer looks like? He said, no, I'm seeing trees and I'm seeing summer. I'm not seeing summer. I said, no, well, summer is abstract. Jesus says, God is not invisible at all, okay? We can't imagine God, but it's not that God is hidden, you know. We don't have the eyes to see him. You know, biblically, this is an interesting text, and we've tended to always misunderstand these texts because we read them with Greek eyes and they're Hebrew texts, you know. But after the resurrection, almost every time Jesus appears, they don't recognize him. Say, well, why not? He's only been dead a day and a half, you know. And Easter Sunday morning, they say, well, his body changed, the resurrected body. That's not what the evangelists want you to get. They don't have the right eyes. See, they couldn't recognize how somebody who had been crucified and humiliated could be Christ. You know? See, so he had to change their eyesight. So it's not so much, see, with dark nights of the soul, it's not that God disappears. God disappears in the way we imagine God to be. And God does that for a reason. Because if God doesn't do that, we'd always create idols. You know, Nietzsche and Feuerbach. Friedrich Nietzsche, Ludwig Feuerbach were the two most famous atheists who have written, okay? And they're usually maligned and not much liked in theological and church circles. We should like them. They did as a huge, huge, huge service. You know what atheists do for us? They make us clean up our act. You know, see, what they do is they flush out all the false gods we believe in. You know, the gods that they criticize and the religion they criticize should be criticized. You know, I had a Franciscan dean back home, and he had a lovely expression. He used to say, he said, God made us in God's image and likeness, and we've never stopped returning the favor. See, we are always trying to create God to fit our needs. And God allows that. John of the Cross would say, God allows that when we're young. And at a certain point, God says, no more. He even did it to Mother Teresa. You know, Mother Teresa, until she was 27 years old, had these powerful religious experiences. And after 27, it's like God just shut off the things that, no more, no more. You can't have me like that. And she and God were in a 60-year standoff. Like, you know, literally. That's why her dark night lasted so long. Just see that at a certain point, God will no longer come to us on our terms. God will, because then we won't get God purely. And so Michael Buckley, who's probably my major mentor in spirituality, Michael Buckley says, Nietzsche and Feuerbach, their criticism of Christianity and religion is 98% correct. He said, but it's 2% wrong. And that 2% makes all the difference in the world. See, they do us a huge favor by making us clean up religion, okay? They simply don't let us get away with, but God does the same thing. Dark nights are always given to purify us, and God doesn't disappear. God is there, but God will not come to us on our terms. You know, we have to meet God on God's terms. Even Mother Teresa couldn't manipulate that. You know, no longer. You know, God is going to come in this way, and that's the only way, because then God comes to us as God and not as some manipulation or projection or something of our consciousness. You know, so that when the atheist said God isn't there, no, it's just God isn't there according to our imaginative structures of God. Which, interesting and importantly, if we take what is the first dogma about God that's defined in Christian theology, you know, the most important one, it's not even the Trinity, that comes second, you know, and it's that God is ineffable. God is mystery, that God can't be conceptualized, God can't be imagined, God can be known. See, you simply cannot imagine, conceptualize, or adequately speak about God. And we always try, and that's what the atheists do as a favor. They laugh at us and say, that's God, that's not God, and it isn't. So, see, a dark night, it's not that God disappears. God takes on a pure modality, and we simply can't perceive him anymore. Let me leave you with a very, very simple analogy. It's an awful one, but you'll get it. Remember about 3 years ago where our TV cable channels announced this? I think it was like February the 7th or something. They said on February the 7th, if you have an analogical television, no more reception. As of February the 7th, all signals are digital. So you've had this box sitting in your room for years. It pulled pictures out of the air, and one day at 5 o'clock, that's it, no more. God works like that too, you know. See, Mother Teresa for 27 years pulled pictures out of the air, and then God went digital on her, you know. And the signal is there, but we need a different reception box, you know. That's essentially what a dark night is. And so that the signal's there, and we're not picking it up, God's saying, work on your receiver box. The signal's there, but it literally, it's a crass analogy, but it captures it. At a certain point, God, and with people like Mother Teresa, they can name the day, the hour, the minute. You know, God was always there. Bingo, no more, no more. And Mother Teresa always wanted to go back to that analogical box. because she had powerful experiences and pictures there. And God said, Teresa, no, no, and no. There's no more analogical. There's something new. And see, so whenever God disappears in our experience, it's always a question of my receiver, I got to readjust, and it's got to be new software bought and put inside of me. Those are horrible analogies, but you get them. Okay. I think I'm getting the signal. Thank you. It's been wonderful being with you.
Wow, what a day of enrichment and so much food for growth, right? So much fodder for growth here that happened today. Thank you so much for joining us this day. I just want to bring a couple of things to your attention before you go. Number one, Melinda Donovan would love you to fill out the evaluation form because it will help her in her job very, very much. Number two, this orange sheet that everyone received with the program for the day on it. It also has some information about a retreat at the OMI Retreat House, the Immaculata House in Willimantic, Connecticut this summer, which will be a time of intense centering prayer. So some of you may enjoy that. And then on the back side of this is a list of all the centering prayer groups in the Boston area, right here in the local area. And you can contact any of those people if you would be interested in joining one. What we do during a centering prayer group is we usually meet weekly. We sit and do the centering prayer, then we enjoy the practice of Lectio Divina, and then we have some input on the spiritual life that we discuss together. So that's pretty much what we do. They're usually 90 minutes long. And I have grown tremendously through that centering prayer group, and it has kept me disciplined. It has given me a discipline in the midst of my very busy life to stay grounded in my prayer practice. So again, I just want to thank you so much for coming today. On the back table, there is a list if you would like to get more information about some of the programs and days of prayer or introductions to centering prayer that you might like to have at your parish. You can just sign that sheet on the blue table and give us your email and your phone number, and we'll be happy to contact you. So I'm just going to let Melinda close.
First, I just want to extend thanks to Father Rollheiser. This has been a wonderful day, and thank you for all that you've given us. There's so much to mull over in our thinking and praying. Very grateful for your presence here. I'd also... I'd also like to thank everyone associated with the Contemplative Outreach of Boston for all the work they did, registering, preparing things for the day, selling the books. There's a lot that went on behind the scenes that you don't see. And I would also like to thank the staff of Church 21 Center, as well as School of Theology and Ministry staff. Nathaniel, here with the mic over here, is one of our PhD students who works with Church 21 Center. And Nat, two people named Nathaniel, handling microphones. Very biblical. Nat's a PhD student from the School of Theology and Ministry. I'd also like to invite you to 3 more summer events that are coming up, sponsored by the School of Theology and Ministry. These are all free of charge. There's Hispanic Ministry Day, presented entirely in Spanish, on June 23rd. James Martin will be here on July 14th, presenting on Laughing with the Saints. That requires registration and tickets, but it is free of charge, and there's still room. And then our annual Mary of Magdala celebration will be held on Monday, July 23rd from 12 to 3:30 in the afternoon. It involves Mass, lunch, as well as a lecture by Mary Ann Hinsdale. So I invite you to all of those. I hope to see you there. Thank you very much for your presence here today and your continued interest in our programs. Enjoy the rest of the weekend.